Hello, everybody. Welcome to Technosocial, and this is the first episode of a series that we're going to do together with Professor Thomas Hammerich on this book by René Girard, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. And in case you don't know, Thomas is now going to give you a very quick overview of who Girard is, what he did, and then without wasting too much more time, we will just jump into the content. So with that said, Thomas, I'll kick it to you.
All right. Hi, guys. So is this called Rock and Roll Girard? Is that what we're going to call this?
Yeah, that's what we'll call it.
Okay, Rock and Roll Girard. So I'll give a quick introduction to Girard for those who don't know him. So he was born in 1923 and he died in 2015. And he was born in France, in Avignon, but he spent most of his life, most of his career in the States. So he was an anthropologist, a philosophical anthropologist, but also a literary critic. So he basically analyzed a lot of literature, and from that he developed an anthropology, so a philosophy of basically how do humans actually work. And so this guy was he was at a lot of big mainstream American universities. So he was at Duke, he was at Bryn Mawr, he was at Johns Hopkins, and he finished his life at Stanford. So we're not talking about some kind of new age thinker here. This is somebody who is like deeply embedded in academia. But he's pretty controversial, and I think you'll discover why during the course of these talks why that is so. So he published his first book, Mensonges romantiques et vérités romanesques, in 1961, and this was translated as Deceit, Desire, and the Novel in 1966. And there he basically posited a theory of human desire, and we'll go into more detail about that, of course, today already, I think. And so his main ideas are mimetic desire. So desire is triadic. There is a subject, a model, and an object. So there's always three. And then he also has a theory of religion, which is based on the scapegoat mechanism. So these are two really big ideas, and basically these two big ideas, they serve to explain why humans behave the way they do, essentially. And the book that we are going to take a look at is called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. And that was published in 1978 in French, and it was only translated in English in 1987. So quite a bit of time between the first French edition and the first English translation. And this is a book that was written with two others, with Jean-Michel Hougourlian and with Guy Lefort. And Hougourlian is also a very interesting thinker. So he wrote books like this one here, The Genesis of Desire, and this one here, The Mimetic Brain. So this is also a very interesting thinker. So, and the book is basically a set of reworked conversations between Lefort, between Hougourlian and Girard. And so this book, which has about, let's say, it has about 450 pages. So and this is the book that we're going to work through in this series.
Thank you, Thomas.
I think that's my introduction.
Great. So the way we thought we'd go about this is go through chapter by chapter. So we're going to do an episode about each chapter. So we do the first chapter today, which is called The Victimage Mechanism as the Basis of Religion. And the chapters are conveniently divided into subchapters. So we thought, at least initially, what we'll try doing is going through subchapter by subchapter, just to give it a bit of structure to the conversation. And so actually the first little bit of chapter one is Girard pointing out where his theory sits in relation to the prevailing academic discourse around religion, where he's basically pointing out that on the one hand, you've got the schools that kind of just write religion off as some kind of absurd, the familiar scientific Enlightenment critique. It's just mistaken logic. It's a wrong way of looking at things. Or then you've got the school of structuralist anthropology, which begins with Levi Strauss, right? which is looking, if I'm understanding it right, to kind of describe religious and cultural systems in terms of their own symbols, in terms of their own internal logic, but not looking for a fundamental driving mechanism that explains all of them. It's kind of, he sees it, it's abandoned that idea of a general theory of religion in favor of just looking at how they look on the surface. And Girard is saying, this is wrong. We need to take religion seriously. Because the consequences are quite dire if we don't. Do either of you guys want to pick up there?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, he calls it the evacuation of religion. So this giving up of explaining religion and of explaining an underlying mechanism that could be used to explain all religions. And I stress all religions. So Girard believes that he found a way to explain why we have religions, why religions are there, and that there is one explanation for all religions.
He connects the process of harmonization, right? And this is already moving from this first subchapter where he positions himself with relation to academia and to the 20th century and to those traditions. But he dares ask, yes, a deeper question, right? Or he dares break a lot of convention of current thought of his day and say something like, hey, I've discovered the basis for the sacred, which incidentally is also the basis for the process of harmonization from monkey to man, and even for the root of all culture, right? In page 7, which is already, and forgive me for skipping ahead a little bit, but even on page 7, he validates or defends this claim by saying, if human beings suddenly ceased imitating, all forms of culture will vanish. And this means precisely that this is the principle that underlies human culture, mimesis. And then throughout the rest of this chapter in the book and his career, he basically takes this one idea of mimesis and sees what happens as it applies in different constellations, and as it is taken to its sort of last consequences, right? But I think this is cool, right? If all human culture is imitation of others. Mimesis, as he says.
And there's the point, right, where he's emphasizing why he chose to use the Greek word mimesis as opposed to just imitation, which is familiar. And because imitation, at least to our ears, has a relatively harmless connotation to it. Imitation just sounds like copying. I see Daniel do something and I want to do what Daniel does. Daniel says something and I want to say the same thing. Or Daniel likes someone and I like someone. Or I see someone who I look up to and I say, and I want to be like them. It doesn't look, or rather the concept of imitation doesn't have contained within it the concept of competition or rivalry, which Girard is seeing as, well, the problematic and dangerous human dynamics inherent to imitation. So, for example, and this is the triadic structure. So this point that if Daniel has something and then I see Daniel desiring it and I then end up wanting it, and then there's only one of that thing, whether it's a job or whether it's a woman or whether it's some food, then all of a sudden, unless there's some kind of common understanding or prohibitionary structure that prevents us from getting into a fight over it ultimately, then we're going to get caught up in conflict, in rivalry, potentially draw the other people around us into that conflict and rivalry. And so Girard said he's chosen his term mimesis as opposed to imitation to give it a bit of a distance from the colloquial understanding of the word imitation, to include within the concept both the relatively, what you might say, banal copying, but also the potentially destructive escalation of rivalry.
Super good. Just a quick point. You've just described the passage from acquisitive mimesis to mimetic rivalry. Acquisitive mimesis is I saw you guys have a drink, I went to the kitchen to make myself a drink. Mimetic rivalry would be if there was only one glass left and we would fight over it. And yeah, oversimplifying it, that's I guess the point here. what happens is this, as he explains these concepts, he goes into something which is the fear of uniformity and how it underlies theories of imitation. Many cultures have built structures and prohibitions in order to prevent precisely the nefarious consequences of mimetic rivalry. So a rule would be, there's only one drink, all three of us want to drink, well, the first one to have the idea gets to have it. For example, that's a rule, a prohibition that will prevent the conflict and the violence that emerges from this acquisitive mimesis, from the fact that we all want the same thing, right? And then he goes on to describe the origin of the sacred, of religions, of social prohibitions, as precisely all having this fundamental root. He even says something really cool. A good part of what we call politeness consists in self-effacement before another in order to avoid mimetic rivalry. So it's these sophisticated social forms that emerge in order to really prevent that.
Yeah, so we're kind of going through an enormous amount of ideas very fast, but that's okay. But I think that one thing that is important to point out is that so the idea that the reason that there's a different word, mimesis, as opposed to imitation, is also because mimesis is unconscious. You don't notice it. So it's like that. There's a classic triangle, right? Your friend gets interested in a woman. Because your friend gets interested in a woman, you become interested in a woman. Now you can notice that, but often these things happen without you noticing it. So Augur Lyon puts it like this: we have three brains. We have the thinking brain, and we're aware of that. So we can perceive our thoughts. We have our emotional brain, so we perceive that we are angry and so on. And then we have a mimetic brain. We do not perceive our mimetic brain. So we do not go around and suddenly notice, oh, I picked up a desire from Owen. Owen has a desire to have a beer, so I have the desire to have a beer. You might notice it, but it basically happens unconsciously. So typically you don't know that you pick up these desires from other people. And that's one of the other reasons why it's called mimesis and not imitation. Because imitation is more conscious. You know that you're imitating someone.
And there's almost a repression of that mimesis or of that, right? He says at some point that adults, like the apes, have learned to fear and repress rivalry, at least in its crudest forms.
Yeah, if we notice it, we recoil. So if you must have noticed that, suppose that you're sitting in front of somebody and that person is behaving in a certain way. So for example, that person is holding his chin like this, and you suddenly notice that you are holding your chin in exactly the same way, right? If you notice it, you will immediately break the symmetry.
Mm-hmm.
It's very deep in us, so because imitation is very, very dangerous. So when we're aware of it, then we recoil from it and we break the symmetry. It's a very dangerous thing, basically, mimesis.
The same concern can no doubt be seen in the prohibition of the use of proper names or in the fear of mirrors, which are often associated with the devil in traditional societies. So it's so deep.
Yeah.
We even have this unconscious mythology built around things like mirrors, like the evil eye, like fear of twins. Again,
twins are really good, right? So this is something that it's kind of a universal thing. So there are a lot of tribes who don't like twins. They're killed or they're separated from each other, and it was always a bit of a puzzle. Why do people fear twins and mirrors and stuff like that? Well, it's because they show undifferentiation. People become the same, and one of the dangers, the people are the same when they have the same desire, and when they have the same desire, they compete, and when they compete, they go in conflict, and when the whole tribe goes in conflict, the whole tribe basically a tribe can wipe itself out, unless it kind of limits the violence to some extent. And this is where religion comes in. So religion basically it tries to structure mimetic desire. It tries to structure desire, and it also has mechanisms, and often very cruel and brutal mechanisms to stop violence when it happens in the tribe, and that is basically the whole theory of Girard in a nutshell. There's somebody who once said, I don't remember who it was, but you know, there are kind of two thinkers. There are foxes and there are hedgehogs. And hedgehogs, they have a few big ideas and they really pursue them, and they explain a lot of things with basically few ideas. And foxes, they have an enormous amount of ideas, right? Most philosophers are foxes, right? I mean, you know, like there's an enormous amount of ideas, and you can kind of, you know, like keep on reading and try to come to terms with more and more complex ideas. I mean, I'm thinking of somebody like Heidegger, you know, but Girard is a hedgehog. Girard has two big ideas, basically. You know, desire is triadic, and religion is based on the scapegoat mechanism. That's it. And then an enormous amount of implications follow from that.
Yeah, and it kind of, in his concept of religion, there's basically two elements to it. There's prohibition and ritual, which I guess we can talk both of. So prohibition, we've already started to talk about. So prohibition, anything that prevents people from getting into these unconscious, destructive rivalries. Taboos on names, as Daniel mentioned, splitting up twins, but also prohibitions on certain behaviors. I mean, I think the book goes into this later, but for example, the 10 commandments that are famously at the core of Judeo-Christian religion are very much about prohibiting escalating desire of objects like women or possessions.
Women are objects?
Oh dear, now we're in trouble.
Now you're in trouble, Owen.
Now I'm in trouble. Well, this is why we're doing this outside of academia.
Exactly. No, it's like the crazy thing here is that to keep mimesis in check is important, because when it's like a fire that is in a candle, but then if you let it go, it just consumes the whole thing. Still as imitation, still as mimesis. For example, the imitative character of violence is in fact most manifest in explicit violence, where it acquires a formal perfection that it had not previously possessed. At the level of the blood feud, for example, there's always one act of murder, right? Somebody kills another person, and that person, there's no law to punish the murderer. So what happens is this same murder is performed in the same way for the same reasons, in vengeful imitation of the preceding murder. You hit me, I hit you. And so this imitation propagates itself by degrees. It becomes a duty for distant relatives who had nothing to do with the original act. So this stuff can contaminate across communities, families.
Well, this is precisely mafia culture and gang culture, right? Just feuds that escalate because they exist outside of the judicial system, which is what Girard points out, that more advanced cultures have an impersonal third-party legal system that when disputes like this emerge, bring judges and juries in that have no, or ideally no stake in the conflict, precisely so that they can judge and distribute punishment in a disinterested manner. I mean, interestingly, right, in Greek tragedy, there's a series of 3 tragedies called the Oresteia, which basically dramatizes this. It's about the transition from a culture based on blood feuds. So if I remember correctly, it's Orestes is the main character, and his father Agamemnon comes back from the Trojan War and then is killed by his mother Clytemnestra. So then Orestes thinks he needs to kill Clytemnestra and her lover, and then he's stained with blood guilt and he's chased by these furies until he makes it to the city of Athens, where the impartial jury kind of establishes justice for the first time. It's a nice story representation of precisely this process, and it's funny because one of the critiques that sometimes goes around of the modern justice system is that it's too cold, it's too impartial. That's precisely the point. The whole point is to not have people who have got a stake in the game judging, not to make it nice, but to make it non-escalatory. It was never supposed to be nice.
Yeah, the judicial institution has to transcend all antagonists. And this
it's not about justice. It's about, you know, stopping people to start escalating feuds. You know, I mean, it's nice if you have a feeling of justice about it, but it's just like democracy has nothing to do with the will of the people. That's not why democracy works. I mean, it's very interesting.
It works as a means of creating this transcendental force that supersedes all the antagonists to be able to legislate and prevent mimesis. And here's the cool thing, right?
No, the democracy is basically because you can get rid of the king without killing him. That's why democracy works, and that's what people like Putin and Xi Jinping are faced with, right? They can't just walk away. That it's very risky for people like that to step down. Dictators or people who are very much in a concentration of power. They are often threatened by people who want their position, and they often cannot simply step down. And if you look at the history of the Roman Empire, we can see that very well in the late stages of the Roman Empire. This is one big sad story about one emperor after the other getting murdered. And the more that you move towards situations that are close to dictatorship, the more you end up in situations either I continue in power or I get killed. And democracy is basically a way to avoid that, because you don't have to kill people, you can just vote them out.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned Roman Empire, right? I mean, this is exactly what is dramatized literally in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Caesar becomes the tyrant, and then the Roman aristocrats create a plot to kill him, and then slowly just descend into factional struggles, and half of them die. And there's that famous line, right? Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war, which is kind of just screaming out the escalation of this mimetic crisis, which perhaps we should start to talk about now, because I don't think we've quite got to that yet. So precisely what happens in a culture once mimesis goes beyond just, say, me wanting the beer because Daniel wanted the beer, or me scratching my chin because Thomas scratched his chin. But actually, we can use the violent example, right? Like, say, I kill Daniel's brother, so then Daniel wants to kill me. And so then people who are close to me want to take revenge on Daniel's side. And then more and more people get caught up in the desire, say, for vengeance or retribution.
Yeah, let me quick. That's a great segue. Let me make a spectrum, a vertical spine that goes from the tiniest possible mimetic rivalries and how they emerge, all the way up to killing kings and nations going to war for each other. The reason why cultures prohibit mimesis, like we have a mythological avoidance of mimesis, like our myths are about like sort of punishing that mimesis, let's avoid that. Even unconsciously, we like Thomas, you were saying, like if we're both doing the same thing, the same small gesture of holding our chin, we will stop. That's almost unconscious, biologically evolved in us. And this could be said to be speaking about mimesis at the very small level, at the level of the tiny things. And why is that? Because mimesis compounds. Because, or rather the rivalry that comes up when there's mimetic rivalry, it tends to compound. It tends to double with every transition. You want to pay back in double what the other has done to you. And that's why you can compound from, I take your beer and it was supposed to be for you, but I wanted it and I take it, and you get a little bit pissed. So next time you can sort of retribute, and the retribution then compounds again and again and again. And that's perhaps how you can go from the small stuff, and it can scale up to, people killing each other. People don't kill each other out of nothing, but as sort of the compounding of a bunch of mimetic rivalries that have emerged and have not been kept in check by the smaller prohibitions, to the point that yes, that it comes up to the higher scale of kings and nations at war with each other as retaliation for whatever previous thing had happened, to the point that it becomes pure violence. You forget why you're in rivalry. You're just repeating what the other guy said. You forget what you're fighting for. And this is
you start with fighting over an object, and then in the end, let's say you're fighting over a woman, right, with a man. In the beginning, you remember what you're fighting about, the woman. But then often the woman leaves. I mean, she might leave even to another country, right? The woman is out of the picture. Neither of you has gotten hold of her, but she's gone. But you hate each other. Right, so the rivalry remains, and this is very typical. So you start with desire that is properly triangle and said that there's an object, but then you can easily get into a certain mimesis that forgets the object, and that is just rivalry.
And then you get this undifferentiation, right? Which is one of the core things about what's happening, is that precisely the prohibitions and the boundaries that establish the ordinary social function, the ordinary social hierarchy, the thing that makes it possible for everybody to to work together, to live together, starts to fall apart. And when it's entering this point that Thomas has said, where the object itself is lost, then, according to Girard's thinking, the parties just end up more and more circling around each other. It's harder and harder to even tell who threw the first stone, so to speak. Everyone's guilty of something. Everybody's pissed everybody else off, and more people are being drawn into the thing, and the intensity is ramping up, because you can always find out, you can always see something that the other guy has done wrong.
Mimetic
Yes,
pride.
it's on
Mimetic pride.
on page 25. It says, if acquisitive mimesis divides by leading two or more individuals to converge on one and the same object with a view to appropriating it, conflictual mimesis will inevitably unify by leading two or more individuals to converge on one and the same adversary that all wish to strike down. So here we have the scapegoat mechanism, right? So if we have conflict between people over an object, and this conflict this spreads over a whole tribe, then in the end, so at some point you need to kind of get rid of this conflict that has spread throughout the whole tribe, and then you find, and then so one way to get out of that is not to sit down and talk to each other, and then find a solution, which is kind of what the Enlightenment would think, right, would happen. But basically the way is that the way out of it is that if the whole tribe is in conflict with each other, then you just find a poor outcast, a scapegoat, and you project all your aggression on that, and then you kill the scapegoat. And so this is called conflictual mimesis. So that your aggression basically focuses and is projected on top of on one person. And that's the scapegoat.
And this is the kind of big, what would I say? It's kind of the most interesting point, the point that the whole kind of theory of religion hinges on, I think. And perhaps for me, it's still like slightly, it takes a bit of time to kind of let that impression sink in. So imagining a community all at war with one another, and then all of a sudden converging on a shared hatred of one object or abject. But I mean, yeah. It's I mean, as they constantly point out in the book, we don't see it happening completely explicitly as they theorize it would have happened, say, hundreds of thousands of years ago in our early ancestors, but you can still see traces of it taking place in culture today. So for example, I think a common occurrence of it is in stuff like schoolyard bullying, where a bunch of kids decide one kid who is the one to constantly pick on, and the cool kids, so to speak, establish an identity and a unity precisely against that one who can't be part of it. It happens in all sorts of other situations too, in social groups. Or if there's, I saw it happen actually in a friend group of mine, where a love triangle emerged, tore apart lots of things, and then one of the guys who was kind of he was the second party to the love triangle, like not the boyfriend, but the other guy. Then he's just kicked out. He's not allowed to be part of the crew anymore. And I went through this all when I was about 20, right, without realizing what was happening. And I was like, fuck him. He's he betrayed us. And it's like, oh, that's exactly what happened. We totally just fucking kicked this guy out to preserve the unity of the rest of us, and totally forgave the girl who was fucking both of the guys.
Yeah, that's typical. yeah, that's a very good example. I mean, like we are. And that's what Girard would say, right? We are still under the spell of these very ancient mechanisms, and the more that you're trying to get rid of them, the more they kind of pop up everywhere. Because so in pagan religion, And this is what paganism is, and nobody wants to hear this, right? Because paganism is so cool. This is like, oh, paganism is kind of, it's kind of like loving nature and thinking sexuality is a good thing, but this is not what paganism is. Paganism is built on really streamlined scapegoating and slaughter. So it's, instead of having this, what you describe is a spontaneous mechanism, right? It's a couple of people who kind of scapegoat somebody and it happens spontaneously. There are no rules. In a pagan society, you would do this, let's say every full moon, you would know that there would be a ritual coming where you would kill some slave or some captured soldier or something like that. You would go through a whole ritual where you would kill that person. So you would know about this mechanism, and you would exploit it to bring the tribe together. It wouldn't be left up to the initiative of some individual people, right? No. You would have a whole society that would make use of this mechanism, of this scapegoating mechanism. And that's paganism. That's what paganism is all about. That's the core of paganism. Greece was pagan. The Roman Empire was pagan. They regularly killed people to unite the society. The Roman games in the Circus Maximus. The Greeks, they had their pharmakos, a slave that they regularly killed slaves in a ritual. And those slaves are called the pharmakos, and that's actually where we have the word pharmacy from. It's a cure and a poison at the same time.
And even today, right? Human beings are soon moved to make religion itself into a new scapegoat, failing to realize once more that the violence is theirs. To expel religion is, as always, a religious gesture. So even today, when we have these pagan versus Catholic type things, oh no, it's the Catholics who are the mean ones. My God, proving the point.
Yeah. No, it's Christians are being scapegoated quite a lot. I mean, the most uncool thing you can be now is being Christian, right? So that's kind of like it's a nice group to scapegoat.
It's a spontaneous psychological mechanism at the basis of community and of religion and of how people connect around shared beliefs. It's just a very dark insight, the idea that there has to be a scapegoat, there has to be an abject. The stone that the builders reject to form the arch is the rejected stone, is the one that you don't want. Rejection, murder is what underlies social cohesion. And that's
it gets even more dark, right? So that because this is what people don't understand. Like, so it sounds now that we are scapegoating paganism. Oh, paganism is bad. Not at all. And Girard doesn't do that. Girard says, like, without paganism, without this mechanism, we would not be here. We would not exist, because that is exactly the process of hominization. So the humans, they emerged from the apes because they started copying each other, because they started developing mimesis. In contrast to the reputation of the apes, humans actually copy a lot more than apes. I mean, that's how we spread culture, right? So humans are copying machines, not apes. And because humans started copying a lot, they started getting to conflict because they started desiring the same objects. And so you need a mechanism that gets you out of that conflict. And that was the scapegoating mechanism. So becoming human meant copying and slaughtering. Without paganism, we would never become humans. So Girard doesn't really condemn paganism as much as he says, like, well, we went through so many thousands of years of that mechanism. Now it's time to we can understand what's going on and we can move beyond it. And basically what Girard is basically saying is it's the end of religion, essentially. So maybe we can leave that for the later chapters, and but basically, so in a sense that the becoming aware of this scapegoating mechanism means that the whole concept of a god becomes quite problematic.
I think at this point the thing that we should spend a little bit more time explaining is that difference and the transition, say, between the original tribal undifferentiation leading into the murder of the victim towards the organized pagan religion. Because that's one of the things that Girard emphasizes, like, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that Originally, it wasn't so much an organized thing. You've got to think of our early hominid ancestors just getting into the mimetic rivalry, escalating to the point where it's the conflict of all against all. Then somebody shows up who they all agree to hate, they kill, and then everything calms down. It's like there's this huge, ecstatic, almost orgasmic explosion ending in a murder, and then things calm down. And then here's where Girard's theory that that the concept of a god starts to begin. There's something supernatural about what the fuck's just happened. But for the ancestors that don't yet have rational cognition, don't yet have logic, don't yet have science, all it seems is that there was this massive frenzy. This person, we suppose, or animal was killed, and the killing of the animal has produced a kind of magical effect that's pacified everything. So now what do you want to do? Well, the next time that happens, you want to do the same thing. You want to invoke that same magical force. You want to create that same ritual. And gradually over time, I don't know how much time, whether it's hundreds or thousands of years, this starts to turn into a more formal structure where it's not so much that like the pressure builds up and then it explodes out, but actually you presumably have some kind of priesthood who go, all right, we need to do this every Sunday, or we need to do this 12 times a year, or whatever it is. And so we're going to keep a stock of animals, a stock of victims, and we're going to invite everybody down, and we're going to go through the ritual. I mean, it's probably the same thing that you can see even up until very recently with like public executions and public hangings, right? Bringing someone out to get everybody riled up to see that motherfucker die.
And the origin of religious ritual is precisely the imitation of this foundational murder, and the repetition of sacrifice and ritual sacrifice has the purpose of releasing the salutary effect of sacrifice for the benefit of the community. So you kill the goats, you ritualize the original murder. Christianity does that. Everybody participates, everybody eats the body of God, everybody's complicit. We have killed him. So this is the Christian version of it, which is different, we'll see in subsequent episodes. But the point is that the ritual repetition of the original murder is uncannily similar to the original murder, right? You dance as if to mimic the original murder. You do these contrived plays, but their purpose is to release those magical effects of community binding once again, without having to actually repeat the original murder with all the chaos that ensued from there. Pagan ritual and pagan sacrifice is precisely that, and we see it everywhere in culture.
Yeah, that's right. It's a reenactment of primordial murder, right? So Freud was quite right about that. Girard kind of refined it, but the main idea was, Freud had that basic idea that somehow society was based on murder of the father, right? But I mean, he basically thought that this murder of the primordial father would be repeated again and again, and that's Girard's theory is different. But Freud came up with had the same intuition that the primordial murder had something to do with the formation of culture, and so this is where we probably should bring in myth, right? So what's a myth? A myth is just a justification of murder. So the myth explains why we need to slaughter the scapegoat regularly. That's what myth is. Myth is murder, as I used to say, right? So it's basically, you know, like okay, we're gonna have a nice frenzy. You know, every month we come together and we kill some, you know, we kill that old woman in the woods with a funny nose that nobody likes, right? But we need to have a story that justifies this murder, right? So that's basically what myth is. So ritual is the murder, and myth is the justification of the murder. And this, of course, is kind of a bit of a disappointment for the followers of Jung, and maybe also the followers of what's his name, Jordan Peterson and stuff like that, because, you know, these people are very, very fond of reinterpreting myths in very constructive ways and things. But Girard would basically disagree with that, right? You're basically just trying to get wisdom out of justification of murder.
This is an interesting one because it gets into the kind of conversation of, say, the difference between myth and art, which is something maybe for a later episode, but it's something that kind of feels important for me to double into. It's like, we might say write off myth precisely for the reasons Thomas just laid out. But then what is art in culture? What is the artistic type? What is it to go and witness a play, or to listen to a song, or to be in a dance, or whatever?
I agree with Thomas, but I have the opposite view, or maybe I misinterpreted. But with like the fact that myth is murder is precisely why myth works and why it's cool. Because it releases that in their inherent pathos. That's why we love good art. Good art is always flirting with risk and death and excess, and it has a certain edginess, right? You don't want to hear the guy who's a virtuoso who plays the whole piece just normally like an executor. No, you want to hear the guy who's taking leaps and who's taking risks and who's putting his heart on the line. He's sort of sacrificing himself, his whole reputation in that performance, and that is in some way, I would argue, releasing the salutary effects of sacrifice. To have a myth that is captivating. We don't understand the mechanism by which things are captivating, but that mechanism is exactly the reproduction of the murder, the reproduction of that scapegoating murder. So whenever we see a good art, there's has to be a murder in there, whether explicit or implicit, and that's why it's good art. What do you guys think?
Well, it's a tricky one, and it does take us a bit away from this chapter. Thomas, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I guess that this stuff will come up when we there's a chapter on myth, right? But I mean, I agree and I disagree with Daniel in the sense that so I mean it's good to consider tragedy. So Nietzsche also wrote a book about this, like The Birth of Tragedy. And so what is tragedy? Well, over the course of the millennia, we kept moving away more and more from explicit murder, and we started with human slaughter, because it was humans that were slaughtered. Then it went to animal slaughter, and then it went to sacrifice of objects. And then it went to theater, and then you can see that tragedy is basically just ritual. It's ritual slaughter, but it's kind of simulated on a stage. But it's supposed to have the same effect, which Aristotle called catharsis. Yeah. So, and there you can see that art has its origin in ritual. Art has its origin in slaughter. That is often why art is often violent and associated with the outskirts of society, right? So, and also why actors were in the Middle Ages. Actors were not much better than prostitutes, right? They were both on the edge of society, and so this is because art, to a certain extent, or art has its roots in ritual, and ritual has its roots in slaughter. So in society, you have like two times. You have ordinary time, and then you have liminal time, ritual time. So in ordinary time, all the prohibitions are there, like no incest, no cannibalism, and all of that stuff, no violence. And then in ritual, all of these things are reversed. We still have it in carnival, right? Carnival is suddenly anything goes, right? Well, to some extent, but it's kind of like things that are not okay outside of carnival are suddenly acceptable in carnival. And that is because in a ritual space is very different from ritual time is very different from ordinary time. In ordinary time, you have prohibitions. In ritual space, you're going to break the prohibitions. And often the slaughter is accompanied by conflict. In a ritual, the whole tribe is going to pretend that everybody's fighting. And why is that? Well, that's because the original murder was originally instigated by conflict in the tribe. So in the ritual, you're going to recreate the primordial murder, and that means you're going to first pretend that the tribe is fighting, and then you're going to solve the conflict by killing the scapegoat. So art is very, very much rooted in that. And that's why art is always associated with the Dionysian, with paganism, with this kind of like the dark aspects of society. And that's because it has that, it's rooted in this liminal space, it's rooted in ritual space, and we are always looking for that. We're always looking for this going back to this ritual experience, this liminal experience. We look for that in let's go into football games, or maybe even football hooliganism, or art, or BDSM, or or electronic music or psychedelics. All of these things are associated with ritual space. And one of the aspects of 20th century of Western culture and modern culture is that we go there, but it's unstructured. We don't have any way to structure our ritual spaces anymore.
Well, this reminds me of the bit in the chapter. Have I got the page? Yes, page 27, where Girard is saying that Levi-Strauss believes that the aim of ritual is to achieve undifferentiation for its own sake, which actually quite nicely captures the way that 20th century culture seems to think about undifferentiated spaces, like football, like the nightclub, like doing drugs and getting high with your friends. It's like, well, it's getting high. It's for fun. It's for recreation. It's just what you go and do. But Girard is saying, like, no, what's been forgotten, but of course it's still there unconsciously, is precisely the way that the undifferentiation is there to create a sense of unification against some adversary. I mean, in football, it's very obvious because you've literally got the other team there. And actually, football is probably one of the spaces that is more structured than, say, a nightclub. Football, at least the stands are separated, and there's been trouble with hooliganism throughout the 20th century. But in the 21st century, they're actually pretty fucking hot on it, at least at the professional level. But say in a lot of nightclub culture, a lot of hippie culture, a lot of party culture, the identity is unified against the absent other, which is kind of mainstream straight culture or the patriarchy or, you know, whatever it is. It's that we come to this place to be subcultural and different and to rebel against that and experience ourselves as being other than that. And the majority of people that you meet in a lot of these kind of unconscious or low-level rave party spaces are very angry against daddy, so to speak. There's a lot of protest. There's a lot of infantile, I think, rejection of what culture stands on. The only thing that can really be seen in culture is evil, culture is corrupt, culture clamps down on our freedom, culture doesn't let us express ourselves. So we have to go into this space to be who we are, to really let ourselves out, which actually falls back into the kind of romantic individualist myth that Girard is critiquing elsewhere in this chapter. That one of the things that that Enlightenment culture really has done, partly to difference itself from imitation, from mimesis, actually, is kind of fetishizing this idea of the true self, of the individual, of the self-expression. And it's kind of funny because Girard's like, they kind of start from the correct intuition that there's something problematic about copying other people, but turn it into a deluded way of thinking about it. Rather than actually grappling with the concept of mimesis head on, they create a kind of fantasy image of the pure self, you might say. Which, of course, is big in modern spirituality as well. Everything's about discover your truth, of course. And it's all enter into an undifferentiated space, do loads of fucking psychedelics to discover your true self.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny. But reading Girard is kind of like, I mean, it's kind of a bit of an interesting experience because you suddenly see this enormous structure, right? And that's maybe good to spend some time on, because you mentioned Claude Lévi-Strauss, right? So structuralism. So this was one of the great attempts of the 20th century to find a common structure under the behavior of humans and under the institutions of humanity, under human civilization. And it was, of course, swept away by the post-structuralist, post-modern revolution, right? Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard, and Althusser, and stuff like that. So, and I think that Girard is clearly closer to Lévi-Strauss than to the post-structuralists like Derrida. So Lévi-Strauss wanted to find common mechanisms that were there in basically in humanity, in human civilization. And Girard would disagree with some of or many of the principles that he poses, but Girard, I think, agrees with Lévi-Strauss that there are mechanisms that are common to humanity, and there I would even say that Girard would say there is truth out there. You know, there is, I think that what is it called again? Help me out there. Is it, what is everybody very critical about? It's like totalizing systems. Is that what it's called? You know, a system that explains everything.
Hmm.
So I think that Girard has a system that explains maybe not everything, of course not, but a lot, and it's actually quite interesting to see how this leads to a great unification of explanations for a wide range of phenomena.
What I like about Girard is not so much that he has a system, but that he has or a workable hypothesis, like a little rule.
It is a hypothesis. It is
Right.
a hypothesis that he, of course, yeah, but in that sense, is often accused of being this big system that explains too much.
Mm.
And well, obviously, I spent a lot of time with Girard, so I think it's a great theory. I think it's on par with what Darwin did for biology. So Girard is often called the Darwin of the humanities. I totally agree with that. I think that there just like in biology and in genetics, there is a before Darwin and there is an after Darwin, and I think that the case of Girard is the same thing. There's a before Girard and an after Girard.
So to summarize what we've been talking about so far in this one chapter, there's this one quote that I think we've kind of been all over the place, but there's this one quote that I think is a good key sort of learning, which is, to understand human culture, it is necessary to concede that 1, only the damning of mimetic forces by means of the prohibition, and 2, the diversion of these forces in the direction of ritual, are capable of spreading and perpetuating the reconciliatory effect of the surrogate victim. So on one side you have prohibition that tells you that you shouldn't do certain things. It goes from me doing this and then you shifting it, so unconscious embedded prohibition. It also goes into sort of social prohibition, and that's on one side. On the other side you have ritual, which is this real reversal. It's the reenactment of the original murder. It's, yeah, let's be doubles, yeah, let's mimic each other, but we do it ritually. And both these things have the same effect, which is they are both anchored on the primeval murder, and the purpose is to continue peace. And to, yeah, he says here, the sacred is violence, but the worship of violence is supposed to bring peace. Prohibition and ritual are both always connected to violence, to the worship of violence. That's why the sacred can emerge therefrom.
Yeah, so again, so I think Owen already mentioned it, but it's worth repeating it. So you kill the scapegoat, you go from conflict to suddenly there's this pacification of the whole tribe, and this feels like magic. And so the next step is, of course, the deification of the scapegoat. So what you kill, you turn into a god. This is one of the big ideas of Girard, right? So what are gods? They are killed scapegoats. They're remnants of murder. So basically, a religion is murder that turns scapegoats into gods. So gods are basically just dead people. And why is it associated with the supernatural? Well, I mean, there's a supernatural thing that happens, right? The tribe is in conflict, they kill a scapegoat. The whole thing is pacified. Magically, everybody's united again. So you start associating something supernatural with these scapegoats, with these people that you killed. And so it makes total sense. So what is a god? What is religion? Religion is the sacred, and the sacred is primordial murder with a little sauce over it. So basically, that's what religion is. It's basically murder.
And it's interesting.
Or at least the religion with gods in it.
Towards the end of the chapter, Girard starts to talk about the fact that we're no longer as religious as we used to be. And this is celebrated in Enlightenment thought as being the triumph of reason over foolishness, you could say. And there's an element of that is true, according to Girard, and I agree with it. And yet the Enlightenment view is far too optimistic. It simply seems religion as being grounded in primitive delusion rather than a proper understanding of the anthropological mechanisms that gave rise to it. And so it thinks that it can be easily discarded. And there's a point that's quite frightening, where he emphasizes the thing about where we're at is that we still have the desire to scapegoat victims, but the unifying effect that comes from going through the process of doing that no longer serves to unify the community in a satisfying way. So there are plenty of ways to try and scapegoat someone, but it never quite works. There's always social conflict remains. There is not a totally established, say, Colosseum where we can all go, or at least everyone important in the society can go and watch some slaves die brutally and then go, let's all go for a beer. We're all friends after all.
Yeah, that train has left the station. So that doesn't work anymore. We can still do it. We can still kind of, especially online, right? You can still form a mob and then go after people and dox them and what have you. But there will always be people who kind of think that it's not okay. You cannot use it anymore to unify the tribe. And this is, of course, a lot of religions, that has become impossible because a lot of the religions in the last couple of thousand of years have made that impossible. And those religions include Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, even though Islam has a bad rap these days, but it's a very strong anti-pagan current in Islam as well. So the scapegoating mechanism is basically something that for some reason, there's actually something that is worth a bit more study. It's like for some reason that mechanism was seen as it had to go, probably because it only works in a tribe and it doesn't work anymore when you move to cities. So tribes can probably stabilize their societies with scapegoating, but once you have cities and some bigger communities, you probably have to move beyond it, and that's why we have all these anti-pagan religions. Because paganism, like if we have now a return to paganism, real paganism, that's the end game, right? That's the nuclear holocaust. So, and then of course, I just said, like, religion is based on slaughter, but that also means that there is kind of a difference between religions who have a tyrant god, right? Who really believe in a god that can slaughter and scapegoat. These are pagan religions, and then religions who reject that. And they're also called religions, but maybe that's a misnomer. In any case, they're very different from the pagan religions. So basically, if you believe that there's a god in the sky who is wrathful, right, who demands slaughter, then you're a pagan. Now, whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever, or I don't know, or an atheist, if you believe that, then you have a pagan structure. If you do not believe that, then you have a very different structure.
Absolutely. It's almost like the emergence of these non-scapegoating religions has put a dam on this historical flow of pagan religions that has carried humanity up until 2,000-3,000 years ago. And by putting that dam in, it has sort of opened up a space of non-rivalrousness that allowed for the flourishing of a different kind of civilization. Would, even though there were, Romans were pagan, they were a great civilization, but there are some markings of that differentiate civilizations that have a rival pagan and then non-pagan religion at the helm. I'm thinking of magic. There's this one quote, the last one that I'll mention, that I think relates to this, which is, "Magic is never more than a poor use of the dangerous properties of mimesis." I like this quote because, well, you could say that religion is then a sophisticated use or damming up of the dangerous properties of mimesis. But when we speak about magic, I remember sharing this hypothesis with you guys, and I think it makes sense to bring it up here. That when you think, for example, of these neo-pagans of the 20th century, like Aleister Crowley, these explorers at the end of the Christian era, so to speak, ceremonial magic is nothing but the curated use of the properties of mimesis in a sort of circumstance, in a ritual, in a ceremony, right? And usually, like all good art, there needs to be some sort of pathos, some blood, some which is precisely that which brings the magic into it. Or if it's not blood, maybe if it's in a football field, it's a goal at the 92nd minute that just produces that ecstasy, that frenzy that only the original murder might have once produced on us. And so we're veering a little bit off the topic, but if we're talking religious matters, then we cannot leave out the sort of effects of magic and of, because my God, look at the aspects.
Where's that quote, Daniel?
Page 14. And the end of the first paragraph. Magic is never more than a poor use of the dangerous properties of a mimetic mimesis. Has to do with creating doubles. He gives the example of the little doll figure of an adversary that one sticks with pins. In such magic, we see inessential and perhaps late developments that occur at a time when the danger of a double as such has diminished, and when the magician in relation to his religion knows almost as little as contemporary ethnology. No wonder that magic is coming back today. We know nothing of doubles. We've kind of lost the fear of a double in many ways. That's why we're flirting with this.
I can see what it refers to. It's basically just, it's again like twins and mirrors and stuff like that, because twins and mirrors are abominations because they point to undifferentiation. You know, there's suddenly too many people who are similar to each other, and that means that's the sign that the tribe is going to erupt in conflict, right? And then magic has something to do with, well, you know, nail clippings and hair and stuff like that. So that's something that belonged to you, and it's suddenly taken away from you. So again, it's a doubling mechanism. So and this is where magic comes in, right? Magic is often related to dolls and hair and nail clippings and stuff like that, because it indicates again the emergence of doubles of
social media.
Yeah, but that's a very good point. And so this is related to stratification, right? In a tribe, you would have the very clear mechanisms to keep people apart. You know, you're the chief, you're the hunter, you're this and you're that. So you would give people clear roles in order to keep them from competing with each other. And if you have undifferentiation, then everybody is competing with everybody. This is the problem. This is basically what we've created the perfect. They've created the perfect magic nightmare with the internet, right?
Yeah,
we're all connected to each other. We're all doubles. You know, you can kind of see it at somebody's Facebook feed, right? And there is absolutely no barrier anymore. I mean, you're connected to bankers, to people who are richer than you, poorer than you. There is absolutely no differentiation. And so basically, the internet is a nightmare of magic gone wrong. Magic in the anthropological sense, right? It's nail clippings everywhere.
Yeah, just ghost in the machine that you can very easily enter into a total fascination, fetishization with people you've never met.
Voodoo dolls. You know, your Facebook avatar is a voodoo doll. And I guess now with Meta, you know, it's not Facebook anymore, it's Meta. I guess with the virtual universe, we're going to have a lot of virtual voodoo dolls running around.
And it's funny, right? Because this is all being celebrated by the tech class as bringing us closer together. Because
closer together.
Again, go back to that Levi Strauss quote. There's almost this like culture celebrates undifferentiation for its own sake because it feels good.
It's tantra outside of a controlled space.
It ultimately brings back, like at the beginning, I think if it's beyond the pleasure principle, it might be society and its discontents. Freud quite brutally attacks the oceanic feeling and the mystical experience as basically he's like, look, you know, when you're first born, you don't have full control over your bodily functions. You shit and you piss yourself and you cry and then your mum puts it in your mouth. You do have a feeling of being more intimately connected with the world around you than you do as an adult. Actually, learning to be an adult is slightly learning to prevent and prohibit your own bodily functions for the appropriate times.
Mm-hmm.
But going into the undifferentiated state of consciousness, or that blissful oceanic feeling, takes you back to that very infantile place, which feels good because there's no responsibility, because there's no need to actually just say no to anything. Ultimately, you can just piss and shit all over the place. Ultimately, and that's kind of what this undifferentiated state is. That's kind of what I'm thinking about it. It's fun. It feels great. You can just be like a baby. You can do whatever.
But what that generates is the need for a very strong boundary creator, or at least violence against those who come in and ruin that pleasure, right? The culture wars emerge precisely because of the undifferentiation, because everybody wants to be the same, but it's not that exactly overlaps with each other. There are competing objects of desire writ large in culture, like law, like influence, like resources. And all of a sudden, you have a polarization of different places in culture, and this is how you use the sort of magic of the interface and the pin needle of the like or the little heart, and you use that to cut apart the body politic of culture and make the house divided against itself. No.
Well, I'd speculate that, for example, in the culture war, at least there's a beginning, there's actually a battle between, say, the two different parts of religious mechanisms that don't recognize each other as belonging to the same thing. So, for example, the core, you might say, of a conservative outlook on the world is that prohibitions are good, that there are certain moral restraints on behavior that are necessary. And the core, you might say, of a liberal outlook is that people should be free to express their desires. And so on the one hand, you've got prohibition, and on the other hand, you've got ritual. Essentially, you've got a desire for the differentiated state and a desire for the undifferentiated state. And then these two camps, because they don't no longer experience themselves as belonging to a religion, just see the other as preventing and destroying the thing that they want to stand for. But of course, then it escalates, and then it just becomes a battle over who is the authentic voice of culture.
Yeah.
Who are the good people and who are the bad people? And then,
I would just add to that there's a sort of the in addition to that, each of these cultural camps has kind of a secondary function. On the liberal side, you have the prohibition of prohibition itself. And then on the conservative side, you have
freedom to prohibit.
Yeah. Or the ritual freedom to prohibit. Yeah, there's a sort of secondary inverse case in each of them, but you're spot on, right?
Yeah, they're two groups of people who are, one group is defending ordinary time and the other group is defending ritual time, basically.
And fighting over time itself.
What would that mean? Fighting
I don't know.
over time. Okay, it sounds good. Well, yeah, you could say like people are fighting over time, like you want to be in, but the thing is that, and this is a bit something that we will probably touch upon that later because the whole can of worms, right? But you need to some extent both of these times, and this is where we might go beyond Girard, because Girard would say like, stay within ordinary time at all times. I think so. He doesn't see any benefit of being in ritual space anymore. But this is a bit of an extreme. It's probably unreal. I don't think it can be done. I think it's actually undesirable because you want to have art, you want to have the fringe, you want to have creative chaos, and I think that Girard is very much the philosopher, the anthropologist of ordinary time, and of explaining why it needs to be there, why prohibitions need to be there, and why things can escalate into paganism. But I think these are two sides of the same coin. So basically, yeah.
I can imagine that we'll discuss this in the future, especially this connection and how to properly think and live out the difference between ordinary and ritual or liminal time. Because I think we have some interesting things to say in that. But on page 32-33, Girard begins to speak about phenomena like trance states or possession that occur frequently and attain a quasi-normal status within the human group when ritual goes haywire, or when it flirts too closely with, or is it the frenzy of conflictual mimesis?
No, these are just aspects of a ritual space. So if you want to create a ritual, you really want to create a ritual space, a trance, possession states, trance states, intoxication, cannibalism, breaking sexual habits, incest, and stuff like that. That's all what happens in ritual space. Ritual space is like everything you don't do in ordinary time, right? Because you want to have your tribe undifferentiated so that they can kind of unite again. They can unite against the scapegoat. So you want your tribe to undifferentiate. And how do you get that? Well, intoxicate the tribe, give them drugs, let them do fasting, don't eat and drink for a couple of days and all of that stuff that brings people out of their head, so they have an easier time to undifferentiate, and then they can unite against the scapegoat and get to the catharsis. So all of this stuff. So all of these, and also music, pumping music with a doom doom with a kind of a regular beat, all of that stuff that's just like pushing people into ritual space. We have huge industries that are based on trying to get people into ritual states and ritual spaces.
Let me read like a quote, and I want to throw it to you guys because I think this is so pertinent. The so-called cults of possession attempt to reproduce the mimetic trance and its conclusion in victimage because they view this, justifiably as it seems, as a fundamentally religious experience, talking about trance and hallucination. Hallucination and perceptual scrambling can only favor the transition from acquisitive and then conflictual mimesis to the reconciliatory mimesis centered around a single antagonist, the scapegoat. Here's the key thing. The victim polarizes and arrests the hallucinatory phenomena. This is why the primitive deity is quintessentially monstrous. And by monstrous, I'm thinking about the cultural figures of our time, of art, of mythology. Like, we live in a time of monsters in many ways, precisely because of this. Would you...
Look at art, modern art, right? It's an enormous amount of monsters, and look at the movies. I mean, it's like, I love monster movies. You know, actually yesterday I was watching Godzilla. That's fantastic. You know, like this big lizard who was just destroying New York City. It was fantastic. I mean, we love monsters, and that's because they're associated with ritual time. You know, this is basically what it is, right? The primitive deity is monstrous because it's the appearance of the scapegoat to a mob that's out of its mind. So they see monsters in a leper. You know, let's take a leper. A leper are often deformed, right? So imagine like you have like a tribe that's out of its mind. It's been fasting a couple of days, and then it's taking, it's eating magical mushrooms or eating some hallucinogenic frog or whatever. And then you throw a leper in there with a deformed face. What do you think the mob is going to see? It's going to see a monster, and it's going to kill the monster, and then the monster will reappear as a deity, right? So then you have monstrous deities.
Well, and not only that, but I think, as I mentioned before, a lot of people who really live in these ritual time, subcultural spaces view normal time as totally monstrous. In fact, that's kind of part of the mythology of those spaces, that normal time, that normal world, that normal people are monsters. And so I imagine that's where a lot of the projections onto society itself as monstrous are coming from. It's like, what is your scapegoat when there's no actual scapegoat present in the nightclub? Well, it's everything outside of the nightclub. The nightclub is the space where freedom and love, and of course you're high on MDMA, so you hug everyone and I love you, but they out there, they don't understand us.
Yeah, it's very funny. Huh? So again, this Girardian way of thinking it really puts a lot of pieces of the puzzle together, and you suddenly start seeing like a lot of the things that don't really make sense are difficult to explain. We'll later come to things like BDSM and stuff like that, which is very difficult to explain for in many other systems. These things make perfect sense. So there's an inherent logic to a lot of the absurd things that humans do. Like killing twins and finding mirrors problematic. And often these things have a very simple explanation if you follow the logic of mimetic desire and you follow the logic of religious structure. So in that sense, it's basically Claude Lévi-Strauss, the program of Lévi-Strauss accomplished essentially, because there seems to be an underlying system that ties together different cultures over different times and over different spaces.
Here's a provocation. Among us three, we have a vision. We have a provocation to Girard. We're saying something that he never says, or we're daring to interpret it. Let me know if you guys agree, which is the idea that the deliberate and well-crafted and curated play with scapegoating energies can be productive, with ritual space can be productive. And I'm not sure, but does Girard ever say this? I think not. And I think that's a difference that we suggest. So that's our manifesto.
I think you are right. I think that Girard does not accept that this ritual space can be put to constructive use. You should read his book on Shakespeare. This is like really.
I have it here.
Have you read it?
Not yet, but
because it's kind of Girard just endlessly hammers on all the stuff that people do. Like love triangles and I mean, I mean, I think he would not understand. He would not accept that BDSM can be constructive, for example. I think he wouldn't get that, or he wouldn't say like, no, this just leads to this will just get out of hand. So I think he would have. Well, I mean, he would definitely agree with, for example, the economy, that there's something constructive about the competition in the economy. But in general, if you read the book on Shakespeare, right, you can see that there's a whole range of human behaviors that I would argue could be they're dangerous, okay, but they can be constructive if you know what you're doing. And I think Girard is not really exploring that aspect. For that we need Nietzsche, right? Although Nietzsche kind of goes overboard on the on the other aspects, a bit like, you know, I would, if I would have a time machine, right, I would just get Girard out of Stanford, and I would get Nietzsche out of Switzerland, and I would put them together. We give them beer, or no, I guess wine, or wine for Girard and beer for Nietzsche. Or so I think actually Nietzsche didn't drink.
Opium, give him opium.
Yeah, we'll give him opium or whatever, and then I would just, you know, let them talk to each other and explain their visions to each other, because they're very, I think they're very complementary, and Girard was fascinated by Nietzsche, right? He called him one of the greatest thinkers of the greatest thinkers ever, right? Because Nietzsche understood. Nietzsche was the first one to understand that that God was a scapegoat, right? So when Nietzsche says that we killed God, right? It wasn't only saying that God, people didn't believe anymore in God. He was also hinting at the fact that God is a killed scapegoat. That's very clear if you read Nietzsche.
Absolutely.
That it's not only this cliche interpretation, oh, we killed God, we don't believe in God anymore, blah blah blah. Basically, some kind of simple atheism, right? Nietzsche is never simple. Nietzsche is always ambiguous and open for different interpretation. That's what's great about Nietzsche. Nietzsche also hinted at the fact that God is dead and we killed him. It's because God is the scapegoat. We killed the scapegoat, and the resurrected scapegoat is a deity. Nietzsche knew that.
Yeah, in one of the early pages of Beyond Good and Evil, there's like a paragraph where Nietzsche pretty much outlines the whole thesis of Girard's career, of the fact that God's a scapegoat. And I mean, we will perhaps in future episodes, not perhaps for sure, talk about how, yes, God is a scapegoat, but there are pagan religions that see the scapegoat as a guilty victim. He deserved to die. And there are the other religions like Christianity and Buddhism and whatever that see the God that is scapegoated as a victim, which changes the whole thing.
That will be. I suggest that we don't go there today, because that's a whole. I mean, that's an episode in itself. It's like the difference between religions like Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and so on, and pagan religions. There's a big difference, and I think that is also very interesting to explore, because it's so provocative, right? People are so fond of paganism. They basically, you know, like paganism is like associated with, you know, nature and sexuality free of inhibitions and stuff like that. It's kind of like, you know, it's Rousseau. It's basically Rousseau. It's like, you know, the noble savage. That's the modern interpretation of paganism. Which is, I mean, they should read Gibbon, right? The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, if you want to see what paganism is about in its late stages. I mean, the late Roman Empire is one big depressive story of murder and decay. It's like,
but it's funny, right? Because a lot of the speech kind of in the neo-pagan communities is just anti-organized religion. So you can see in that a longing back for the really primordial state, for the really just let us be free, and every now and again. Well, I guess Girard would say let us be free, and every now and again kill someone. Of course, the neo-pagans wouldn't say that. They don't see that as being integral to what they do. They see it more as just a nature worship and some magical rituals. And the conversation about magical rituals as well kind of gets into other playful things that you can do with the scapegoating energies, I guess, which we've touched upon. But there's a longing for it, right? There's a longing to go back to a spirituality that isn't religious. That's very popular at the moment, to have that feeling of being connected to God, the feeling perhaps of undifferentiation, but there's a skepticism of the institutions and the structures that prohibit behavior and explain this is how you have to do it. And you could even speculate that from a Girardian angle, there's a kind of truth in that, which is a fear of the pagan institutions of religion. But then I think Girardi is even making this point at the later bits in his book, that religion itself has kind of become one of the modern scapegoats. People see that itself as being something that leads to, suffering, repression, potential crisis, escalate. Because, I mean, it's true, the history of religion is still a history of conflict, or rather, you can do it the other way. The history of humanity is a history of conflict. Now, the Enlightenment view is that the history of religion is the history of conflict, and now we're enlightened. We don't necessarily need conflict anymore. If you actually look at the history of the Enlightenment, it's it tells a slightly different story. You've got fucking world wars, yeah, and now you've got endless Twitter scapegoating. But the myth of this time is still that religious history was brutal. Now we can get beyond that because we don't have to kill each other in the name of God.
But precisely the modern times have seen a removal of religion and a gradual equalization of all peoples under economic liberalism, democracy, equal rights, and all that. What that has caused, right, inadvertently, one of its unintended consequences has been the creation of an immense incentive for violence as a means to bring about differentiation. So when I open up my YouTube feed and somebody, Lavrov was talking in the UN, the Russian guy, and he said what he said, then he left. But the YouTube, the title of the video was incredibly incendiary, incredibly inflammatory. Even though war is a horrible thing. So my point is the following: we are unconsciously bloodthirsty because we've been made so equal. And by bloodthirsty, I mean desire violence against the other as a means of differentiating ourselves from the other. My God, give me an enemy, give me someone who's not me, to provide identity, because people instantly recoil from this doubleization, from this indifferentiation, is what I would argue. There's this unconscious bloodthirst that comes in even at the most, or especially and precisely in the most peaceful and equal of periods.
Yeah, it is true that we don't. So there are, and this is again something that we should probably discuss later on. But I mean, there are mechanisms. We live in very peaceful societies, and then the question is like, why are we not killing each other, right? Because there are fewer prohibitions, and that's of course because of capitalism, and
right,
because of democracy. So we have some compensating things that stepped into place after religious prohibition started to wither. Like, you know, capitalism, the idea behind capitalism is very, very simple. So there's of course constructive competition, right? Constructive mimesis, but there's also just like, what do you do if people want convergent objects? Well, you just flood them with objects. You make sure that they compete over objects. And then you give them a lot of objects. That's why we don't kill each other. And that's why we will start killing each other if capitalism breaks down, right? If you don't make sure that people want objects, you know, they're well fed and they're, you know, they can afford to agonize over expensive watches and cars and clothes, prestige basically, and we flood them with objects, right? So that works, and then that pacifies a society. But of course, if we stop flooding them with objects,
does that work long term?
Hmm?
Can that work long term in a sustainable fashion?
Well,
I mean,
that's
the
big question, right? I mean, it's like, look at the 20th century or World War I and World War II. I mean, we had systems like fascism and communism. We had the gulags and the camps. These are blatant returns to paganism, right? And the Nazis were just basically, they knew they were pagans. You know, that was basically, you know, Nietzsche. You know, Christianity is terrible. You know, we need to go back to, you know, powerful people kill the weak people. And communists, they have good. I think communists they have good intentions, right? They have good intentions, but then they end up, you know, putting a lot of people in camps. So that's kind of like it's kind of an illustration that good intentions are just not good enough.
There's always the need, especially when people are equal, which is the premise of communism, for a transcendental judicious force. The deployment of violence has to be transcendental to all in order to be able to regulate all these equal folk without without risking retaliation.
Well, you know, communism ended up with just another pagan system that used a scapegoat to unify, right? In this case, the bourgeoisie, kill the bourgeoisie. You know, like we have so many, and you know, there might be forms of communism that can escape that, maybe, but in practice, it's very hard to come up with systems that don't go there. So it's very simple. It's very, you know, you can create all these nice systems and look at this, good intentions, and it sounds good on paper, but in practice, you always end up like, well, it kind of works. It works for 99%, but we have to kill 1%, and then it will work completely. And you know, we will sacrifice this 1% in order to attain perfection. This is the pagan idea, right? That's the pagan idea, and that always, for some reason, people always, you know, a couple of times in a century, they think it's gonna work this time.
Yeah.
Now it's really gonna work, and then we're done with this. And you know, so this is the big temptation, right? The big temptation is to just let's go pagan again. That'll get us out of trouble. That happened in World War II.
I feel so inclined to like steer the conversation sideways and go to a parenthesis, because it feels to me like the reason why we come back to these same patterns time and again is because it's very hard to put in practice the ideals of self-renunciation and renouncing, especially the desire to scapegoat the other, in a tenable basis. It's very hard to be Christian, or you know, and I'm skipping ahead a lot. But the premise of why certain systems are not prone to the pagan violence is precisely because they put you in a position of not being a pagan, of you know, it's not about, the scapegoat is not guilty, it's innocent. So refrain from reproducing mimetic rivalry. That's the message of, for example, Christianity. But it's very hard to be that and to act that. And that's, I guess, why we come back time and again to the same cycle of violence. And I would even argue, and this is just between us, there's absolutely no introduction to this in the video so far, that has to do with self-renunciation. Self-renunciation, broadly speaking, of one's own desire.
Well, it's interesting, right? Like if we think about the 20th century, if you look at the ideologies of both communism and of fascism, they're both explicitly rejecting rampant capitalism. They don't want to live in a society where the market is the highest value. And why is that? Well, for one thing, even just a mimetic reading of that, it's actually quite painful to being in a society where supposedly everybody's equal and everybody can climb to the top and there's all this wealth everywhere, but it's actually quite hard to get wealthy. And there are still people who are richer than you. It's much easier to say live in a traditional feudal society where, say, I'm a peasant and Thomas is an aristocrat, and it's like, well, that's just the law of time. That's the way things are. I'm going to live my peasant life. He's going to live his aristocrat life, and blah, blah, blah. If Thomas is a bourgeois and I'm a proletariat, and supposedly the only thing separating us is the fact that he's worked harder than me, then there's a lot more possibility for resentment to build up. And then you can look at just even today, the kind of the critiques of materialist capitalism. I do have sympathy with that, like a life that's just spent chasing objects the whole time can get quite boring and can get quite draining and can get quite tiring. And it can come to dominate all other forms of relationships. It seems like everything is filtered through the lens of money and exchange. And there's a truth to that. So you can sympathize why in the 20th century there were thinkers saying, God, this capitalism thing is terrible. We want to get away from this. And you can kind of see certainly in the Nazi way of thinking, there's both a longing back to the pagan religious structure, but also a kind of longing back to the aristocratic structure where we're going to have an elite who are just better than the others, who direct the country like that. And even in certain forms of communism, I think that's there in Leninism as well. I might be getting this wrong. Maybe it's Stalinism, but the idea that you basically need the dictatorship of the proletariat who understand, who will lead the stupid masses into the communist future.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth in that. Yeah. So there's something disappointing about focusing on desiring objects that you can buy, because that's basically why capitalism works, right? I mean, capitalism would it would be a problem if people suddenly start competing about things they can't buy and that you can't give them. And so now we're actually in interesting times, right? Because in order to keep the system running, you need a lot of energy. You need a lot of oil, right, to make all these products. So you're basically also using a lot of raw materials. You need to burn a lot of oil. And so now, like there's a bit of a problem with this, right? So you have climate change, and the energy is becoming more and more expensive and stuff like that. So this is not good news. This is very good news, because if we don't keep flooding people with objects, and basically that requires a lot of raw materials, a lot of energy, then they will start getting unhappy.
Desire,
unhappy.
I think we're
sorry. Pagan pop.
Right.
Go ahead.
Speculation. Tantric self-renunciation is a political gesture because it represents authority over one's own desire, but it says that you shall not desire objects or things you can buy, but it's supposed to renew the relationship with your own desire, to give it new terms of engagement that are not necessarily capitalist. And in a time where the tactic of flooding people with objects in order to prevent their mimetic rivalry from going overboard, when that tactic is now becoming a little bit spent, it seems to me like the root of authority, the root of how to steer people's desires, may have something to do with sexual self-renunciation. My God, just look at pornography, just look at OnlyFans, just look at how Instagram has equalized everybody and put everybody chasing people and completely skewed the sexual marketplace. These are not marginal, weird events. They are central. Just look at the United States. Just look at feminism. These are all consequences of a political sexual problem that, from a Girardian lens, can be, I guess, seen as a problem that has to do with submitting to desire versus renouncing that desire in ourselves. And I think that's a deeply political thing.
Then you cannot wait until to get to book 3, chapter 3, mimesis and sexuality, right?
But the thing is, Girard doesn't say.
Maybe
this is yet another speculation. Girard will just say be Catholic, and that's the end of the story. And what I'm saying is perhaps Girard, it's if you lived for 10 more years, and if you see what the internet is doing, yes, it's along with your predictions, of course, but it's gone to such an extent that Girard doesn't have a political project, right? And it might be that this political project that I'm just speculating right now is just another form of paganism. Well, likely, right? But the point is that
his last book, Battling to the End, was I think very political. Well, it was a political book. Okay. I think also to the end of his life, he said something that you would probably like or agree with in terms of what you just said, and that is that for all my life, I have thought about being outside of mimetic desire. So he had this idea of you adopt this. Basically you're Christian about it, right? So although I would be careful with calling it Christian, because the Christianity of Girard is very different from what people would think about Christianity. We'll get to that later on, right? But basically what he said is that what he was thinking is that he was thinking outside of mimetic desire, in the sense that there is an outside, right? There's a religion that takes you outside of this mimetic desire. And then in the end he said so we have to think from inside mimetic desire. And that was towards the end of his life. I'll look up when actually he said it, but this is basically corresponding to what you are talking about, and it has something to do with Sutra and Tantra and working with desire and transforming desire and conversion. What does conversion mean? And so I think he's basically talking about what you just talked about. And maybe since my beer is finished and we are also 1 hour and 40 minutes, so maybe this is this is a good time to wrap it up and to reach a certain conclusion. Owen, Daniel, have anything some last things to say? Unless you really want to discuss another topic.
No,
to end.
We'll renounce the discussion of the topic and leave it for future sessions. The next episode is going to be.
I think especially the chapters on sexuality will be very suitable to discuss these type of things.
Yeah. Right. Beautiful.
I'm very happy with how this has gone. This has been a lot of fun.
It was fun, yeah. Next session, the development of culture and institutions is the next chapter that we're going to talk about. And
so we got kings.
So we should maybe warn people that this is a gigantic project. So this is this book consists of three books basically. So book 1 is Fundamental Anthropology. This is where we started. Book 2 is the Judeo-Christian Scriptures, and book 3 is Individual Psychology. And then book 1 has 5 chapters, book 2 has 4 chapters, and book 3 also has 5 chapters. And we just did chapter 1, Fundamental Anthropology, the victimage mechanism as the basis of religion. So this is the absolute start, and there's a lot of stuff coming. So how the Omanization, for example, so how this explains the emergence of humans from apes, texts of persecution. There's a very interesting chapter on mimesis and sexuality, which I think will be quite provocative for a lot of people, and also critique of Christianity for those people who think that Girard is just is just a simple Christian apologetic. So that will be definitely denied by the reading of book 2, chapter 3, namely the sacrificial reading and historical Christianity, where Girard deals with the pagan nature of much of Christian history. So that's to come. Hopefully, I mean, if we survive the apocalypse.
If we can hold it together for another 15 episodes, minimum.
Yeah,
and we have all the other 21 books by Girard. So
yeah, we might. I mean, we might go into a mimetic rivalry and stop talking to each other. Right, that happens. All right, guys. Shall we call it a day?
Yeah, let's do it. Cheers, guys.
cheers. Thank you.